not just the president, but the founder of SoCal Snow and Avalanche Center. And thank you for arranging our sponsor, and many thanks to our sponsor, ARC'TERYX La Brea, for making it possible for Alan to provide this education for everybody. So without further ado, here's Alan.
All right, thanks, Keith. I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. I want to thank everybody for taking some time out to be on this program with us. If you were here last week, thanks for coming back. Obviously, I didn't torture you too much, so you can endure another program with me. And thanks, David, for your presentation. Ski Kind's a really cool program. I think it's long overdue and much needed for our community. There's certainly a lot of pet peeves I've had over the years, and hopefully this will help out in raising a lot of awareness. So thanks for coming in and sharing that with us. Looking forward to talking to you soon. So I see that most of our people came in through Instagram, some from Facebook, and I'd be curious to know how many people actually use the Avalanche Center website, because that's where all the work really goes. The other outlets, our other social media, are just ways of getting information out to you and reaching to people. But if you haven't, I encourage you to go to socalsnow.org. Super easy website. But what we do is we're a level 3 Avalanche Center, so we're not in the position to put out danger forecasts, but we do put up snowpack summaries. And depending on what's going on in the mountains and the weather, there's a lot of times, as we all know, this season we really haven't had any snow. We don't really start doing that until we start getting the snowpack, which has started to begin and hopefully will really fill in these next few days that we have a good snowpack out there. But I encourage you to visit the website. It's a nonprofit organization. All of us are volunteers that are running the program. And these kind of events like we're giving tonight are free and provided to the public for education and information about the mountains. So if you go to the website, I'd like to ask you if you can make a donation. Any little bit helps, and that's how we keep this program going. The last thing I want to say on that note is our sponsors are a big, huge part of this, and ARC'TERYX La Brea has given up some cool items tonight for us to give away at the end of the show. So stick around and we'll test your knowledge and see if you learn something. And we'll get into our program tonight, which is avalanche awareness. And what I do want to say about that is that this is basically a primer and an introduction to avalanche safety. This is by no means a program that's going to prepare you to go out into the mountains. This is just going to let you know what you need to learn, what you need to know, and you need to go out and get the education to fill that in. So your avalanche classes, backcountry training, seek out mentors, get out there with more experienced people. And for those of you that do have experience, this will probably be a good refresher. We'll touch on a whole bunch of stuff that you do see in an Avalanche Level 1 course. But I've got you for roughly an hour, and an Avalanche Level 1 course is a total combined 24 hours of field and class sessions. So there's no way I can convey that kind of information in this short period of time. So we're going to get right into avalanches. And the first thing we got tonight is the Chevy Avalanche. And you're asking, why are we looking at a Chevy Avalanche? Because the take-home message for tonight is, don't get caught in an avalanche. If you own an Avalanche, that's okay. We still like you, and you can come ski with us anytime. What I got coming up now is a short video. We'll watch that, and then we'll get into the meat of the program. Oops.
The only things I thought were, I'm gonna die right now. seeing the sheer massive raw power. It's like facing death and knowing it's over for your life, and it's a feeling like no other, really. There's nothing you can do. There's thousands of pounds of snow all around you. So it's like, so you guys can look up, it's like, pretty good. Okay, good. How you feeling, man? Is everything okay? That was a good nice, man. We got him. We got him, man. He's out. He's alive. This is massive power, part of a global energy cycle. It's happened before. You know it's going to happen again.
All right. Well, I don't think anybody really wants to experience that. It's pretty intense just watching it from afar. And this is actually pretty old video footage, but it's still pretty timely regardless. Some things just don't change. And as noted in the bottom here, on average, 30 people will die in North American avalanches this season. That's pretty much the average over the last 5 years. What I'm going to bring up next, and people wonder why do we have an avalanche center in Southern California, is an event that happened about 13 years ago. And at that time, we had more of a snowpack already in place, but we had a large storm, something kind of like what's going to happen now, with a significant amount of snow in a very short period of time. And anybody that's familiar with Mountain High knows there's some great terrain outside of the boundaries of the resort. But that's closed terrain. It's not managed by the ski resort or the patrol. And I want to make a note that when you go out of bounds, when you leave the boundaries of a ski resort, you're basically in the backcountry. So they've got names like side country, slack country. It's basically backcountry. Even if you just pop out there for 3 or 4 turns, cut back into the runs, it's the backcountry. Your ski resorts are managed and controlled to provide safety for the guests. So they do avalanche mitigation work. That happens at Mammoth, happens at Baldy, happens at all the ski resorts, so that they can make the runs as safe as possible for everybody that goes there. You've also got ski patrol that monitors the mountains and those areas and deals with any incidents that happen. The minute you go outside of those ropes, there is no control, there is no monitoring, you're on your own. So you may as well treat it as leaving a trailhead and going off into the mountains to go backcountry skiing. And so on this particular day, it was actually 13 years ago, this past Monday, we lost 3 fine people that were very experienced backcountry skiers. They knew their way around the mountains, and they had been into these areas numerous times. It was just a significant amount of snow and conditions that actually created this event and put them in this position. So what we're going to do for the rest of the evening is kind of look at this and pick it apart and try to learn how to prevent being caught in that same position. And out of respect for these people, I hope that you all, if you plan on spending time in the mountains, you go out and get the education if you're not already educated, and you practice these skills. So this next slide is actually where one of those victims was recovered in the canyon just outside of Mountain High. And one of the things I want you to note here is at the bottom of this, down in here is where they're recovered. and you've got this steep gully, steep-sided gully. And take a look at this tree right here. So on our next slide, this is the top of that same tree. Here's the crown line where the avalanche broke loose. So, and we're back down here. So the avalanche broke loose. That slope is about 80 feet high. Not very big in the grand scheme of mountains. But they recovered him under 11 feet of snow down here. And that's because you've got this gully, which is what we refer to as terrain traps. And we'll discuss that more in depth later on. But it doesn't take a big, huge mountain for you to get in trouble in avalanches. And that's the point I want to make here. So we're going to get into our program now. And traveling in the backcountry is a great way to have a good time with your friends, especially in these COVID conditions. It's really the one thing that we're still allowed to do, and we're encouraged to go outside, get into the open air, exercise. You can keep your social distancing and have some space. And due to what's happened, the use of the backcountry, and Dave brought this up in his presentation, has just escalated. Over the spring and the summer, the numbers have been huge, and they're anticipating the same thing, especially looking at equipment sales through into the winter. And so we expect the backcountry users to explode into our mountains. And we're a little behind with snow coming in late, but it's going to happen here. So the biggest danger you have to mitigate, you always have to manage danger when you're in the outdoors. And for the winter backcountry mountains, it's going to be avalanche risk. And to add to that, in our local mountains is slip on ice conditions. We actually have several fatalities each year in our local mountains due to people slipping on icy, snow-covered ridges and peaks. But that's another whole topic, and we're not covering that tonight. So getting into this, avalanche fatalities by age, generally it's that 20 to 30-year-old demographic, but it's actually expanding into the older demographics. We got more people getting after it. People are staying in better shape, so they put themselves at risk. And the way to prevent that is by getting the knowledge and learning how to manage that when you're out there. And then avalanche fatalities by year, you can see a slow, steady climb from 1950 to 2020, going into like the mid 2010, it kept going up. And then for about the last 5 years, we've had a decline. Even though the user group has increased, our avalanche fatalities have decreased. And there's a lot of speculation, but there's no concrete evidence on what this is, what's causing it. There could be a lot of factors to it, which is people are becoming more savvy themselves. Education is becoming more prolific and people are taking more courses. Also, avalanche centers are becoming much better at what they do. The forecasts are being more spot on, and the information is much more accessible and more proliferate out there throughout the world. So all of these things could be combining to this. And whatever it is, I hope it continues. And it's nice to see this actually going down with more people going out there. So one of the things we have to think about is who's at risk. And honestly, you guys were asked to list what your activities were and pick from a series of activities. And if you didn't get in on that, feel free to keep Keith busy. He's hanging out in the background there, but use the chat and send him messages about what your preferred mode of travel in the mountains is. But the people that are at risk is pretty much anybody that uses our mountains. We got skiers, snowboarders, snowmobilers, snowshoers, climbers, hikers, and it says anybody that recreates or even works in the backcountry, ski patrol, highway workmen, the guys that go out there and plow the roads. All these people are at risk. And so what we want to do is learn how to minimize our risk, and that's through minimizing our exposure. So then a quick look at avalanche fatalities by incident. If it looks, backcountry tours is basically backcountry skiers and split boarders. Snowmobilers run a close second to that. But then if you take your side country, which is right here, and you add those in, because they're basically backcountry skiers and snowboarders as well, that demographic eclipses everybody else. Then you've got residents, ski patrollers, hikers, motorists, people that work out there, miscellaneous recreation. There's a whole slew, but everybody has the risk of being involved. Currently, this season to date, as of 2 days ago, we had 6 fatalities, 1 snowboarder, 1 snowmobiler, and 4 skiers. And this is pretty low. As I was working on my presentation, I looked at some numbers I had from about 6 years ago. And at this same time that season, we had 18 fatalities. So we're only at a third of that. Again, you guys are stacking the card in your deck, or your cards in your favor, because you're here and you're taking the first step towards your education in avalanche backcountry safety. So most of the time it's safe to travel in the backcountry, and the important thing is learning when it's not. And another thing I want to add to that is probably 90% of the time you're not going to get caught in an avalanche. It's that other 10% that the snowpack conditions are right for an avalanche to happen, and you might be in the right spot. And that's what we want to learn, how to avoid that during that percentage of time. Also, another important thing to mention is that 90% of the time in an avalanche incident, the incident is triggered by the victim or someone in the victim's party. So most avalanches with that number can be avoided. And that's what we're going to start looking at now. Is we have what we call the avalanche triangle. And basically we have components that come together to create an avalanche situation. And to clarify, if anybody's not sure what an avalanche means, it doesn't necessarily apply just to snow. It's pretty much anything that slides down the mountain. In this particular instance, our concern is snow. That's what we're talking about in the winter mountains. So the components in the avalanche triangle are snowpack, weather, terrain, and people. And we'll find out how all that plays out as we move through this. I got you another video here. And this is going to kind of demonstrate how the snowpack develops throughout the season from storm to storm and that. So we'll watch this quick and we'll pick it apart some more.
Snow, that's been getting laid down all winter under different conditions, temperatures, winds. That's what forms layers, and that's where avalanches happen. So the day you're going to show up with your friends, you better be aware there's way more going on in the snowpack.
And so those of you that joined us last week, in part of that presentation, I mentioned that the pre-trip planning begins with the first snowfall. And this is why. As you can see, the snow builds up over the seasons. In between snowfalls, you have different weather conditions: hot, cold, sunny, foggy, cloudy, wind events. And that affects the snowpack, affects the surface of the snowpack, and then another layer of snow is delivered with the next storm. And for a really simple view, this is what it looks like. It's like a layer cake. And we're not really concerned about the intricacies of this. This is something you would learn in a much more advanced avalanche course. But what we're looking at is how the snow develops and layers and what's going on between those layers. And that has a big play on weakness and strength in the snowpack and between the layers. So to simplify this a little bit more, we're going to do a very simple layer cake here, or a layer diagram, where we have a base layer. This is the snow. Say, for instance, right now, this is what's sitting on the ground. And during this last storm, we actually had grapple, the little styrofoam balls, fall from the sky. So we could have a layer of that distributed widely throughout the snowpack. That can be a weak layer. It's not a very strong, cohesive layer. It's not a very supportive layer. And then we get this next storm that comes in. It builds up a recent snow, or a storm slab, as listed right here, or a slab layer on top of that. Could be from wind, could be from a storm. So what happens is you get something that looks like this. You've got a much more consolidated layer of snow on top. And then you can see here, you see more light. You can actually see little layers in between that. And these are some of those different layers you see in the snowpack. This obviously is going to be more dense and more cohesive, where this looks like it's got a lot more air in it because you can see more light through it. And then I got another video here which actually really sort of reinforces what you just saw in that last slide. So we'll watch this.
Standing on just this bomber snow, but as I drop right here, look at that. I mean, it doesn't even hold my glove. This stuff is really...
So if you look at the last photo I showed you, we have that sort of dense, consolidated, darker snow on top, that would be equivalent to what he was poking his fist into that barely penetrated it. And then below, you've got this looser, really airy snow that really has no supportive quality to it. And what happens is this stuff, if you have a weak layer in there, which is what this is down here, it's a very loose layer. And if you add a trigger, something that comes in on top of that and weights it and overloads this weak layer, that weak layer collapses. And that's what causes the initiation of an avalanche. And it can happen in flat ground. And actually, Dave spoke about that when he was walking around the area by his house, just the collapse in the snow as it's building up so fast. So I've got another slide here that sort of demonstrates what's going on there, the mechanics in that. And so we've got our base layer here that we saw in that first sort of line drawing. We've got a weak layer that runs in there, and then this is our slab. That's that snow that developed on top. In this case, it's a slab. It's very cohesive. And we'll talk about that stuff more as we go through this. And then you've got a trigger. So you have Susie Chapstick that comes shushing, or Christy turns into here. And for those of you that remember Susie Chapstick, but she hits a particularly sensitive spot in that upper slab and in the snowpack, and then she initiates a collapse here. So it initiates and then propagates underneath that slab and travels to disconnect everything, and this whole slab breaks loose and starts moving. And when that happens, it looks something like this. So it's fractured here, and then it's sliding down the slope. And if you guys think back to the video we watched, we saw that happen several times. For instance, this is what it looks like. And we saw several instances of this type of thing happening where everything broke loose. So somewhere in this movement here, this guy came through, made a turn, and at some point he hit back in this powder cloud a particularly sensitive spot. It created the initiation, which then propagated that weak layer underneath this whole area of snow, and that all started moving. And that's basically your slab avalanche. Those are the biggest ones we're worried about. And that's what, in the very beginning, that gentleman was buried in that lost his life 13 years ago. In this slide, I threw it in here because it really pictures a weak layer very well. So here you've got all this airspace, and it looks like fine china in here. This is a particular type of weak layer called surface hoar. And that develops on really cold, calm, clear nights on the surface of the snowpack. And if it doesn't get destroyed before the next snowstorm comes in, this is what you get. You've got these feathery crystals standing up, and then snow gets deposited on top of it. And if we think about the breakaway with Susie Chapstick initiating that collapse, here it has actually collapsed, and all this has collapsed underneath it. So it's broken away here, and that's where our weak layer has collapsed. And this next video will actually do a really good job of demonstrating this. It should bring it all together for you.
When I'm walking around in the mountains, I like to think of weak layers like a great white shark lurking just beneath the snow surface. You always need to be thinking, what's underneath me? Take this cross-section of the snowpack. You may be walking in a flat meadow and get the weak layer to collapse, and it might make a really loud noise. But the snow didn't move anywhere. That's a huge red flag. In fact, you just triggered an avalanche. That same snowpack, if you were to tilt it up to, say, 35 degrees, will slide with deadly effect.
So that should kind of bring everything together for you so you guys understand it. And he was commenting about walking through a meadow and initiating a collapse. A few years ago, we had really bad avalanche conditions up in the Eastern Sierra. Me and my partner decided to play it super safe and went out to go just take some turns at some low angle trees. And we're traveling in flat terrain through a meadow. And all of a sudden I heard this loud report. It was like, pretty much like they were launching firing the howitzer up at Mammoth. I even turned to my buddy. I'm like, are they doing control work at Mammoth? It was so loud. He said, no, that just was a collapse. And we continued walking a little bit farther, and it happened again, even louder. And that time I could feel it and sort of see the whole meadow settle. It was super sensitive. And then we went on to our location, which was some old growth trees that was super low angle. We did a few laps in there, had a lot of fun. It was beautiful powder. And we got back out to where we got cell service. And when we got the cell service, we found out that there had been a huge inbounds avalanche at Mammoth Mountain, basically on that same layer, the same conditions that we had experienced out there in that meadow, which is why we were playing it safe. But so there's certain conditions, and that's the terrain factor that has to contribute. So you've created a collapse, but it's not necessarily an avalanche because it didn't go anywhere. It didn't go down the mountain. So this next video actually shows a split border doing a little test slope and triggering a collapse. So let's watch this. And so right there, he initiated the propagation, and then it just shot underneath all that. I'm going to take this moment to give you guys a little bit of avalanche nomenclature. So this is a slab avalanche. You can see all the chunky slabs. It was a very cohesive slab on top of whatever the weak layer was. This up here is what we would call the crown of the avalanche. Along the sides are the flanks of the avalanche. This pile of debris is the toe, where everything winds up at. And this is the bed surface. It's where our weak layer was and what the avalanche slid upon as it went down. Now this next slide sort of breaks apart what happened. So you've got your trigger. We saw him step in, step on that. It triggered the collapse. You've got a slope so it can slide. You can see this is a little convex rollover on a little tiny slope. So it's a little test area, and you know they were practicing good technique with just checking out what's going on with the slope. Then you have your slab and your weak layers underneath that. So that pretty much is what we're talking about with the snowpack in the avalanche triangle. The next thing we're going to move into is weather. And don't worry, we're going to bring this all together for you as we kind of close through this whole presentation. So our next thing is avalanche weather. And weather has a few different components to it that contribute to avalanche conditions in the mountain. The first one is wind. And here's another opportunity for you guys to keep Keith busy. If you guys look at this roof line right here, this peak on the roof would be similar to the ridge on the mountains. And so looking at this, which way would you say the wind was blowing? So from the left or from the right? So you guys could send your answer to Keith and share it out there. In the meantime, what I want to do is throw a little more nomenclature at you. And when we're talking about wind direction, the windward side is where the wind is blowing from, and the leeward side is where it blows to. So if you have a southwest wind in the mountains, then it's going to pick up snow and move it into the northwest or those northerly aspects. Could be northwest, north, northeast, depending on topographic influence. But basically, those are things you want to look at in the weather. What's going on with the winds? And you're looking for moderate to strong winds. So when you get over 15 miles an hour up into 30 miles per hour, that's when you start getting snow really moving around. So back to our question, the wind was blowing from the right over to the left. So it picked up snow on this side of the slope and deposited over on this side. And the reason why we're concerned about that is wind is going to load up snow much faster than precipitation, than just snow falling from the sky. You can have feet of snow load up in just a matter of a couple hours, where it could take half a day to have a foot or two of snow load up. So what that does is it creates a big strain on the snowpack. You're having low snow load up very quickly, and your snowpacks, they don't like to have rapid change. And what that is doing is causing rapid change. And as we go through this stuff, we're going to keep looking at things that cause rapid change in the snowpack. The snowpack takes time to adjust to that. And if you've got a weak layer in there, then that is going to succumb to that rapid change. If you outweigh that weak layer, if you overstrain it, it's going to give way, and then you get natural avalanches. So we've got wind. The next thing we're going to look at is precipitation. So precipitation could be heavy snow or rain. And the one thing I want to differentiate there is snow is mostly water. So when snow falls out of the sky, it's fairly light, but when rain comes out, it's much heavier. So you may have like a 10 or 12% snow. If we get that here, we're super happy. That's really lightweight snow in Southern California. But the reason why that percentage is so low, because the rest of it's air. It's very lightweight. And the metrics we're concerned about here, the numbers are, if you get snow at 1 inch per hour or 12 inches in a 24-hour period, that's what we call a red flag. That's going to create heavy loading on the snowpack. And with rain, of course, it's going to be much faster because you're throwing a lot of weight in there. Plus, it has other effects in the snowpack. It percolates down into the snowpack and will loosen bonds in layers in the snowpack. And real quick, back to our wind question. We'll pretend this is a cornice building above Bruce Tremper here. He's out at his truck. If anybody's not familiar with Bruce Tremper, I highly recommend you grab his book and read it. It's a great read. It's actually fairly entertaining as well as very informative. It's kind of like an Avalanche handbook. But this gentleman standing here is the one that wrote that book. And back to our question, though, which way would you say the wind was blowing on this? From the left to the right or the right to the left? So in this case, the left side of our screen would be our windward side blowing across the top of the truck and creating a cornice, which means it's depositing snow on the leeward side. So that's a nice tool. If you go out in the mountains and you see cornice development, that gives you an indicator. It's what we call nature's billboard of which way the wind's been blowing predominantly and where you can expect to find wind loading of the snow. So on to our next weather component, which is temperature, rapid warming or rapid thawing. And that we generally encounter in the springtime, although in our Southern California mountains, we can see that shortly after having a big winter storm within days. We can see these kind of conditions. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this, and you have to forgive me because I keep wanting to ask you guys to answer these questions. And I'm used to doing this stuff live. So what I will do is have you tell Keith what you guys call this. There's numerous names for it. So why don't you send that to Keith in chat or just to everybody out there and have a little fun with that. But there's a lot of names for these. They're pinwheels, snow snails, roller balls. They all mean basically the same thing, is that the snow's been heating up, the bonds have been breaking down due to water forming in the snowpack or being freed up from freezing overnight, and then they start to roll down the mountain. And that's a precursor to wet slide avalanches, which is another type of avalanche. So we see this a lot happening in the Baldy Bowl, even in the middle of winter. We can go from having really cold winter storm and a lot of snow, and within days, we're in the 60s to 70s down here in the valley, and the bowl's pretty south-facing aspect. It kind of runs the gamut of southern aspects all the way around to north and east. But for the most part, it's very south-facing, and it gets a lot of solar input. So one of the things you want to be concerned about when you see this is that the snowpack is losing its bonds, and it'd be very easy for you to trigger a wet slide avalanche. And we'll cover this a little bit more when we move into another section. I'm going to keep moving here because we've got a lot of stuff to go over still. So we're into terrain now, our last component in the avalanche triangle. And we have 4 components, which is slope angle, terrain traps, we mentioned that earlier, trigger points, and aspect. So everybody, while I'm going into slope angle, tell Keith what you think the aspect is in the mountains. What would you call that? And we'll cover that here shortly. So for slope angle, what we're concerned about is anything that's over 30 degrees. Once you get above 30 degrees, you have the potential avalanche. There are rare instances when stuff slides below 30 degrees, but it generally doesn't really slide down the mountain. And what we're really concerned about is most avalanches occur between 35 to 45 degrees. And when you get above 40 into 50 degrees, the mountains normally slough really naturally and they don't hold a lot of snow. So you don't get big avalanches once you get up into that slope angle. The other thing to note is If we got a lot of skiers and snowboarders in the group, how many of you love to go hit the black diamonds and double blacks at the resorts? Well, those black diamonds and double black diamonds are in that 35 to 45 degree range. So, and of course, we like to play where the Avalanches like to live the most. So that is definitely something to be aware of. And so we want to use that slope angle to help manage our terrain when we're traveling in the backcountry. So what you want to get is what's called an inclinometer, so you can measure the angle of the slopes and get to understand what those are and start playing with that when you're out in the mountains. Next thing we'll get into is terrain traps. Basically, a terrain trap is anything that can amplify the consequences of being caught in an avalanche. And so going back into the beginning of our presentation, where we saw that rescue area, we mentioned that steep-sided gully. That is a terrain trap. That's one of many types of terrain traps. Trees are terrain traps, cliffs and rocks, gullies and chutes, bodies of water. All of those, if you get swept through or over those in an avalanche, are going to amplify the consequences of being caught in an avalanche. And we definitely saw some of this in that opening video we watched. We saw several people going over cliffs and being swept down through rocks. So what you want to do is you want to be aware of what's below you when you're traveling. Are you putting yourself in a position where you're traveling across a steep slope and you're exposed to a cliff or stand of trees below you? Something that, if that slope did slide, or even if you slipped and fell, is going to increase the consequences or amplify the consequences of being out there. And then we get into trigger points. And basically, trigger points are areas in the slope where you're more likely to trigger an avalanche. So, of course, we've been talking about wind loading quite a bit, and we've got the leeward side of the ridges where the cornices signify where those are. Anytime you get any wind loading, and we'll go back to the wind, if you're looking at your forecast, you know you got a southwest wind, you've got to be concerned about where that's loading. So again, we're going into that northerly aspects where it's going to load. And generally, you're going to see your loading below ridge lines or on sides of gullies where the wind can pick up the snow and move it over something and deposit it. Recently, we got a report from the Mount Baden-Powell area, and in that report, they talked about going up and actually seeing wind deposits up to 5 feet deep in some of the drainages, some of the gullies on that mountain. And that mountain in particular is just a number of terrain traps and avalanche slopes. It's some very complex terrain. It can be really fun in the right conditions, and it can be really hazardous otherwise. That particular day, the skiing wasn't great. It was still thin coverage, but they shared some information with me, and that was part of it. We had a lot of wind loading going on. So even though we had about less than 2 feet of snow overall, we had 5 feet loaded into some of these areas. So convex rollovers is another trigger point. If you go back to that little ski demo where the guys did the slope cut on the split board and he triggered the avalanche, that was a convex rollover. Wherever it starts at one angle and it gets steeper, you've got a lot of tension there, and it's a very sensitive point in the snowpack. The other thing we can talk about is near rocks. The snowpack becomes thinner. Sides of gullies and chutes, it tends to become thinner. So those all can be points where you can easily trigger an avalanche, or you're more prone to trigger an avalanche. So now back to our aspect. Hopefully you guys all sent your answers off to Keith. And basically, aspect is the direction a slope faces according to your compass. So the aspect of a slope, if you're facing due north and you're standing on the slope, that would be the aspect of the slope. And the reason we want to know about that is obviously with our wind loading, if we know the wind is coming in from the south side of the mountain, it's going to load snow onto the north aspect. So that's our aspect. Again, we're going to get back into those compasses. And if you're going to buy a compass, look for one that has an inclinometer. The other thing is we're on northern aspects, the snow tends to be preserved better there. It's sheltered, it stays cooler, it gets less solar input. So that's generally where you're going to find powder for a longer period of time. But also what happens is your instabilities tend to last longer there because warmth and heat helps to speed the process of metamorphosis, which helps stabilizing and settling the snow. On the south side, those southern aspects, then you get the faster stability, but you also are prone to wet slides in the spring. And as I pointed out, here in Southern California, that spring could be in the middle of winter. As we get another warm spell, it can warm up really quick. Like we had some snow earlier this season, and then we just had a super long, dry, hot spell. If we had a significant amount of snow up in the mountains, we would have been seeing a lot of wet slide activity following that. So those are the three components of our triangle. And then in the middle of it, we have us, the human factor. And before we delve into this, I want to talk about this photo really quick. This is actually the first submission of an avalanche incident to our Avalanche Center. So this is about 9 years old. And this is on Baden-Powell. We're just talking about that. And this particular slope here has some stuff to be noted. Number one, it's a slab avalanche. You see all these big chunks of debris. Again, we've got our flanks on either side. You can see them a little jagged here and there. We've got the crown at the top and then the bed surface. And also notable is you got these little tiny trees in here. And if you look at the bigger trees on the side, you don't really see any branches down here low on those trees. So let's keep Keith busy, and you guys postulate what your theories are, why we're seeing that, and I'm going to talk about what's going on here. So in this submission, the guy shared his some of the information, and it said there were plenty of obvious signs of instability. Even the dog knew not to go on the slope. So the guy that submitted this actually didn't go out on the slope, and neither did the dog. One man, having never seen avalanche activity here, thought we had nothing to worry about and convinced others to take the risk. So these are a lot of human factors going on here. So they saw obvious signs of instability, and we're going to discuss that more in depth as we go through this. But more of the information that came in with this report is they saw shooting cracks, they heard whooping sounds and settlements, and they still went out on the slope. On top of that, there was 3 people on this slope exposed when the avalanche was triggered by the third person going in. The third person wasn't caught in it. The guy in the middle was carried down the slope about 500 feet, and the guy at the bottom was knocked off his feet. Fortunately, no one was buried. Nobody was injured. Everybody got out there okay and learned a big lesson. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. Like, this is something we really need more in our community. Is people need to open up, and it's happening a lot more. If you got caught in an incident, there's nothing wrong with that. You need to share that experience so people can learn from it. There should be no judgment. We need to be open, and communication is one of the big things. So in this situation, the guy convinced everybody to go. So we're talking about a lot of human factors here. We've got familiarity. I've been here hundreds of times, never seen the snow slide or the slope slide. You've got peer pressure. The guy's like, oh, hey, it's fine. We're all going to be good. So everybody goes. You've got the expert halo. So this guy's the experienced guy, has been there all the time. So everybody's following him. Like, well, he knows what he's doing. No big deal. And there's other things too. Poor communication. Maybe not everybody's being heard. Maybe somebody was concerned and they didn't get the opportunity to express their concern about it. So they're just some of the human factors. And the way we derail those is we use tools while we're out there. We have discussions. We have open communication within the group. And one of the tools we're going to teach you is some of the red flags, which is nature's billboard telling you what's going on. And then along with the communication, you've got to really, really pay attention to what's happening in the mountains and reading these signs. And then to make things easier to change your plans is you have alternate plans. So a real key to your planning before you even go out, you decide on alternate plan B and C, and you have this worked out and agreed on by the whole group so that once you're out there and you're having these conversations and you're seeing these signs of instability, it's like, hey, you know what? We're starting to see the things that we were concerned about. So let's go to our other objective. We're going to go ski the low angle trees today because things just don't look really safe over here. And once you've set that up before you go out, you've really started to derail those human factors. And there's a lot that goes into it. And it's more important to learn how to manage ourselves out there and have these conversations and communication than it is to teach you what the factors are. We can tell you about it all day long, but that doesn't mean you're going to stop doing it. But if we teach you ways how to manage it, you will. And again, that gets back into your Avalanche classes. So to go back to the question I had you guys answer for Keith, all these trees, you know why we have all these little tiny trees here and no branches on the bigger trees? That's called flagging. And it's a sign that this is an avalanche slope. And avalanches frequently, that's why these poor little guys never chance to get to be big like their brothers over here. And that's also why these guys have no branches on the bottom, because the avalanches come through and take them off. So it's another way to identify avalanche terrain while you're out there. So moving forward, so now you've learned about us, you've learned about the snowpack and the terrain, and you've got all these tools under your belt, and you're out there in the mountains, and you've been assessing the snow while you're traveling. You got to start asking yourself some questions and having these communications. So is the snow unstable? Am I in avalanche terrain? Do I see those little trees? Do I see flagging? Do I see obvious signs that avalanches have been here before? And could I trigger an avalanche? When you start answering yes to these questions, it's when you start looking at your alternatives. Well, it may be time to change my plans. It may be time to go to alternate plan B. And that's why it's really important to have these conversations before you even start out into the backcountry, and you share this communication and you make sure everybody's open to talk. And if somebody's not speaking up, encourage them to talk. They may be the person that saw something nobody else identified. So before you head out the door, the most important thing you do before you leave is you're going to check your avalanche forecast and you're going to check the weather. And for us here, you go to SoCal Snow, and hopefully what you've been doing is you've been watching the information on the Avalanche Center for at least a couple of weeks before you go out, or you've been following it all season, and same with the weather report. But if you haven't, arm yourself with that information, because you're going to go in there, and even though we do snowpack summaries, we don't give you a danger rating. We're going to tell you what's going on in the snowpack, what that problem is that you're looking for, where you're going to probably find it. And then you can take that information and know that those areas in the mountains are where you want to be more concerned. And when you have that combined with the weather report, you know if it's going to get warm really fast, you know if you're going to have precipitation coming in later. You're going to get out to your trailhead. You're going to take a look around and go, well, does all this information jive? Does everything make sense? Am I seeing what I actually expected to see? Because with this information, you should be developing a theory of what you should see out in the mountains. And the rest of the time you're traveling out there, you should be spending your time trying to prove that theory. And if it doesn't, you're not seeing what you expected, you want to start asking, well, what is it? What's different, and why is it different? That should definitely bring your attention, get your attention, because something's wrong. The information you had doesn't jive with what you're seeing. So we're going to get into some tools you can use out there. And this is a very simple one. The 5 red flags of avalanche danger. So these are signs that indicate snow is unstable. And red flag number 1, recent avalanches. So if there's been any avalanches in the past 24 hours, and you go out there and you're looking around, and say you go out there and you look at this slope back here, and you're just starting to hike up the mountains, you're going to take note of that. You want to note what elevation, guess at the slope angle, figure out what the aspect is. And if it's similar to where you plan on going, what does that tell you? If that slope slid by itself, do you want to be the trigger that goes out there and makes the next similar slope do the same thing? Absolutely not. And if you're seeing widespread avalanches, it's really telling you that that's just the mountain screaming at you, hey, things aren't good today. You better change plans. So again, this is nature's billboard. Another red flag, number 2, is signs of unstable snow. And so we have this, we've talked about this a few times, and we have that in that trip report. So it's cracking or collapsing snowpack, like you see shooting cracks. For instance, before that slope slid, you saw cracks kind of shoot out from in front of his skis. Well, if you see that and nothing else happens, that doesn't mean it's not an avalanche. That's a sign of instability. That's a big red flag. Whooping sounds. It's literally what it sounds like. The snowpack settles and you hear air coming up through it. It's just whoomph. Hollow drum-like sounds. So go back to the video of the layering where the guy's poking his fist into the hard snow and then he gets into the really loose sugary stuff underneath it. If you're hearing that hollow sound through the snowpack, that's something like that's going on underneath. What that's indicating is that there's not a lot of stability underneath the snow. There's a lot of airspace. There's a lot of loose snow, and you should be alarmed or concerned, and you should be logging this stuff. If you poke your ski pole in there and you meet resistance, and then all of a sudden it just pops and drops through, same thing. You've got a lot of loose snow or something inside there that's allowing your ski pole and not providing any resistance. So that's really not giving a lot of support to that upper snowpack. So another sign is heavy snowfall or rain in the past 24 hours. And does everybody remember what that number was? We had a particular number, how much per hour and how much in 24 hours. So flood Keith with some more chat and throw those numbers out there. And while we're doing that, I want to point out that the majority of avalanches happen on the first clear day after a snow or storm. So if we have a couple of stormy days coming up and we get 3 feet or more in our local mountains, and come Saturday or Sunday, it's bluebird, just beautiful out there, that's when you're most likely going to get caught in an avalanche. The avalanche danger, of course, is high. We got a bunch of new snow. And especially if we have those large numbers where we're seeing over a foot in a foot in a 24-hour period, and especially over the course of several days, that's significant loading on the snowpack. And what happens if it's stormy out there, we tend to be more conservative about what we're doing. But if it's sunny out, we tend to be more relaxed and more comfortable, and we tend to let our guard down a bit. So those numbers are, I said one of them is 1 foot in 24 hours and 1 inch per hour. Those are the numbers we want to remember. If we're seeing that in the forecast or the reports, that's a big red flag. And then we're back to the wind. The wind really plays a big impact in creating avalanche problems out in the backcountry. And in this particular photo, you can see these big fat cornices developing, and you see all this wind blowing off of those. So when you're traveling up to the mountain, you should be looking up at the peaks and the ridges while you're driving in and going to the trailhead. And while you're traveling through the mountain, the same thing. You should be looking to see if the snow is moving around. If it is, take note of where it is and what direction, because that's going to give you an idea where the wind loading is happening. So again, windward side is where the wind blows from. Leeward side is where the wind blows to, and that's where the snow gets deposited. So we want to be aware of that. Another red flag is rapid warming, rapidly increasing temperatures. So if you start out in the morning and you're going, say, the Baldy Bowl, and you're climbing up and you're in your crampons, and by 10 o'clock you're down to your short sleeves and you're sinking into the tops of your boots, that should be a huge red flag. Obviously, it is rapidly warmed, and the bonds in that snowpack have significantly decreased, and you're setting yourself in a position to potentially be caught in a wet snow avalanche. And we have that happen here quite often. So it's a good point to really take note of. So there's 5 red flags, and you guys should remember those. Right now, what you can do is send all 5 of those off to Keith in the chat. Have fun with that, Keith. Now I'm going to go into another video. Since we've talked about the Baldy Bowl numerous times, some of you guys probably recognize this as looking up from the ski hut. And this was a avalanche in process that was submitted some time ago. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the video first before we roll it. So if you look here, we've got the signs of an avalanche. We have this real narrow start point, and it fanned out and got bigger. Well, this is kind of the way wet snow avalanches work. They start out, the cohesive bond has given way, and they entrain more snow. They tend to move a bit more slowly, but they have a lot of power. Burial is not the biggest concern as it is with slab avalanches, but it can knock you over and drag you down the mountain and just drag you through tons of debris. The other thing to note here is you see these little tracks. That's probably rocks rolling down, or it could have been roller balls prior to this cutting loose. The last thing I want to point out before I run it is we got a person here, one there, a couple here, another guy down here, and there's actually a guy behind the tree. So watch as the chaos unfolds.
it gonna hit again?
Yeah. Oh, we just missed it. Wow, we got lucky.
Get out.
Look at these guys running.
Yeah.
With the dog. Those big chunks.
So everybody was fine. Nobody got caught. Nobody got hit. But they were all exposed. And we're going to get into safe travel protocols here in just a moment. We'll talk about that. But this one guy is over on the bed surface of the old Avalanche. So if you were going to go up the mountain, that's probably the best place to go because that's already slid. The problem is you get up here, this hasn't slid. And there's plenty of snow there and it gets steeper. So all you're going to do, you're going to be okay until you get in here, or that could just cut loose on its own. We call that hang fire, and it could come down on you. The other thing is, if you showed up and you saw this, would you climb up that mountain? Let's think about our red flags. What's the first red flag? Right, recent avalanches. So that's the mountain telling you we shouldn't be out there. So let's get into safe travel protocols. I'm going to kind of blaze through this last stuff pretty quick so we have a little time for a question and answer session. So one important thing is never expose more than one person at a time to avalanche danger. And also don't get on a slope above or below other people or other parties because you're going to expose them to potential of avalanche. Much in that photo, there was all kinds of people out there that were exposed. Avoid stopping on an avalanche slope or at the bottom of steep slopes. Go to a safe area, go to a ridge, go to a cluster of trees, a nice anchor point. Stop where it's safely. And give yourself distance as you travel. You want to stay spread out. And the general rule of thumb is at least 10 meters, roughly 30 feet apart. And the reason for that is if something does happen, not everybody's going to be taken out at one time. You want people left to do a rescue, and we're going to get into that here in just a moment. So stay alert to the changing of the snow. That's going to be aspect, elevation, weather factors. All of this stuff changes as you travel up the mountain. Things are going to change. As you move from a north aspect to a south aspect, things are going to change. The weather changes through the day. The wind could pick up. Snow could set in. Whiteout could move in. There's all kinds of stuff. And again, communication, I cannot stress how important communication is. Always be open to communication in your group and have an open line of communication and discuss your decisions. And with that, as you're assessing everything, you want to choose terrain that's appropriate for the conditions. So if the conditions become more unstable or more concerning, it's time to change your plans again. Increase your margin of safety. Our goal is to minimize our exposure and thus minimizing our risk of being caught in an avalanche. So essential backcountry tips is plan for the best, but be prepared for the worst. Things happen. So you want to have not only avalanche rescue skills, but you want to have backcountry medicine skills as well. Somebody should have that in your group. And there's a lot of equipment that you should carry that goes well beyond what we can talk about in this presentation tonight. And it says here, if an avalanche happens, you don't go for help. And we'll find out why. But you are your victim's best chance of survival. You and your buddies are the best resource you have, and a lot of times the only resource. So never go into the backcountry without a properly operating avalanche beacon, shovel, and probe. Those are the three key components, and we're going to hit that again. We want to kind of drive that into your head. So asphyxiation is the biggest cause of fatalities in North America. 73% of fatalities are caused by asphyxiation, 25% by trauma, and 2% by hypothermia. Now, the reason why you're the best chance of survival for your partner or vice versa is that more than half of people that are completely buried die within the first 15 minutes of being buried. After 15 minutes, the avalanche or the survival rate plummets, and only 10% survive after 40 minutes. So there's a very short window of time to perform a rescue. In search and rescue, is not going to show up unless they happen to already be there in that short window of time. It's up to you. So you really have to have these skills down, and it's really important to know them. And the only way to know these, if you haven't had the training, is to go take a course and learn avalanche rescue as well as your avalanche safety skills. So unfortunately, by the time search and rescue gets there, it's a body recovery. And just to reinforce that, here's a graph that shows how quickly the survival rates drop as the clock ticks. So here's 15 minutes right here, and we're already down to almost 40%. Here we are at 30 minutes, and we're almost down to 10%. And the only reason why we have this big outlined arm is because there's been a rare instance in the recording of this that people have been trapped with a pocket of air. And so they're able to survive for hours up to days buried because of that. So to follow this, I've got another couple of videos. And these are going to take us back into the beginning. We'll see some avalanches triggered and see what's going on, and then we'll talk about that. So again, there's another slab avalanche. You can see where he initiated it. It collapsed, and the whole slope just started to move. The video stops there, but unless he was carrying some speed, he might have got up onto that bank and got out of there, but he probably got carried down the slope. And we want to give equal love here. So we got skiers out there. I don't have any avalanche videos of hikers and snowshoers, but know that this applies to you as well. And the big important thing to remember about that, and I should have brought this up when we were talking about terrain, is going back to that meadow instance where you could trigger an avalanche in a meadow. And I told you about the collapse that we saw. We weren't anywhere near any steep slopes, but you could be on very low angle terrain that would, in all intents and purposes, be safe. You're not going to get caught in an avalanche. But if that is connected to 30-degree or steeper terrain, and you initiate that collapse underneath the snowpack, it can travel up that slope, and that whole slope can come down and bury you. And we call that remote triggering. So here's the snowboarder. Again, you get the collapse, and he gets trapped into this, and it looks like he's going down into a terrain trap. You got kind of a gully there, you got a bunch of trees, and then his GoPro gets buried. So he most likely got buried in that. And so when that does happen, our goal, remember, is to not get into that position. But should that happen, then it's time to perform an avalanche rescue. And I can't stress how important it is that you learn these skills and you get the equipment to do it, which is your beacon, your shovel, and your probe. And you practice and you practice and you practice. And then you go practice more. This is the skill you should learn to mastery. You should know how to do this better than any of your modes of travel in the backcountry. Because when this happens, when it comes to this, and you got to get into a rescue, and anybody that's been through any of our avalanche courses or any avalanche course knows this, even though it's a mock rescue, the stress level is so high. It's so easy to make mistakes. So you have to have this rehearsed to rote memory that you don't even think about it. So take a course, learn this stuff, and practice, practice, practice. And the avalanche equipment, the three necessary pieces of equipment is an avalanche beacon, a shovel, and a probe. The beacon is to locate a person when they're buried. It sends out a signal and it switches to receive so that you can pick up a signal if somebody's buried and track them. The probe you use once you pinpoint, locate where that bury is to confirm that they're there and confirm how deep they are. And then, of course, the shovel is how you dig them out. And I'm not going to get into this in a PowerPoint presentation. This is definitely a hands-on field skill you need to learn. You can go to Backcountry Access, has some good videos on it, but a video is not going to teach you what you need to know. You need to work with people that have experience, find a mentor, take a class, hire a guide, get out there and learn this stuff. And then avalanche safety equipment, something that's really useful, they're pricey, but you know, how much is your life worth, is the avalanche airbags. And they don't really float you like something in water. They work on the basis of inverse segregation. And that's a big scientific buzzword, which basically means that the larger items move to the surface of something. And they've found this over years of analyzing avalanches. So with the avalanche airbag, it makes you much larger by blowing a big balloon up on your back. And what that does is the same thing as going to the party, shaking the bowl of nuts, and you're trying to get all those Brazil nuts to come up to the top. That's what happens with this. You're being bounced around through there, debris is being bounced around. The bigger pieces of debris wind up on the surface or near the surface. So the idea is you're making yourself a big piece of debris so you can more easily be found. And so I got one more video for you. And this is a guy demoing an airbag. Just had to do that because on my live presentations, I always brought in my airbags and let somebody from the audience get an opportunity to blow the airbag. Anyways, what I want to end tonight's presentation with is get the training. Get out there, take an avalanche course, take a companion rescue course, get the equipment you need to do this. Find mentors, find experienced people to go out and work with and help you hone your skills and practice and practice and practice to nauseam. Get this stuff down. There is no replacement or substitution for that. There is no substitution for firsthand education and training. This is shot at Mount Baldy, one of our field sessions. There's Keith, our moderator, talking about beacons. And unfortunately, we don't have any Avalanche level 1 courses going this season. We usually just pack them. But due to many circumstances, we haven't been able to provide it. One of our sponsors, Further Your Adventure, will be offering Intro to Avalanche courses. It won't be a full level 1, but it'll help build on this information and give you some hands-on in-field experience. But you really need to get a level 1 course. And the places to go for that nearby is in Bishop. There's 3 guiding services up there. Sierra Mountaineering International, Sierra Mountain Center, and Sierra Mountain Guides. They're all facilitating those courses. They have been selling out, so it may be really difficult to get into one. But there's Avalanche education providers all over the world. And definitely reach out to us if conditions and things change. We may be opening up a course, so stay tuned. Thanks again for everybody coming out. A big thank you to our sponsor. Here's a brief link to some resources. You can go to our website, go to the resources page or the education page. They both have drop-down menus that hook us into a lot of other information out there. And remember, this presentation tonight did not prepare you to go out into avalanche terrain. This only purpose for this is to let you know why you need to go get the education and the equipment and learn how to use it. And then a quick shout out to ARC'TERYX La Brea. We've got a couple things from them in a moment here. And the other sponsors down here provided photos and slides and information that were used in this presentation. So thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll start throwing some questions at you here in a minute. I'll let Keith pop in if he's got anything to add. And then what we're going to do is the questions will be sent out, or I'll give you questions and you'll send the answers to Keith over chat. But first, we want your questions. Send those to Keith, and we'll answer a few questions here.
And while you're typing those questions into the chat, and I will read them out for Alan, let's also take a poll here. We've got 2 more polling questions. Again, these also anonymized. We want to know how often, if ever, you visit SoCal Snow to check on bulletins, and also what topics you might like us to cover in future Fireside chats.
Can I answer?
Well, we appreciate having such a good crowd tonight.
Yeah, what did we wind up with?
We had about 77 people at the top of the We had over 80 that came in from time to time.
Great.
All right. Once we get to maybe 80%
Okay.
in the poll, I will close it and show you where we're at.
And while you guys are doing the poll, remember to go visit David Page's page, Ski Kind. We'll probably have a link up on our website in the next few days also for you to access that, along with all the safety skill and the proper etiquette in the mountains. And let's all be good partners and mentor each other and help each other out there.
All right. At 80%, 81% of you. All right. 55% of our attendees tonight are visiting the SoCal Snow on a weekly basis. Thank you. Topics you'd like. Number one topic you'd like us to cover in future events, snow science. Oh no, we'll all geek out. Jeff Pierce, who you heard earlier this evening, his daughter, Carissa, coined the term snurd, snow nerd, for Jeff and I and others who really like to geek out on that kind of stuff. All right, so let's answer some of your questions. And let me back up here to catch up to them.
And just a quick note, this guy jumping on the skis is a tele skier, launching off those rocks. 3 years prior to that, he was a snowboarder.
So Alan Laura asks, what are some Southern California specific conditions that someone who's used to Alaska and the Pacific Northwest snow be aware of? So how are we different in Southern California from that Pacific Northwest and Alaska snowpack?
A lot less snow. That would be the first thing. I mean, honestly, we're, for the most part, a maritime climate. So you're going to see similar conditions. I'm actually pretty familiar with the Pacific Northwest myself. So we just have smaller or lower snowpacks. And we do occasionally get sort of an intercontinental snowpack. What that means is that we'll have a thin snowpack in very cold conditions, which will cause weak layers to develop and build in the snowpack, which doesn't tend to happen up there so much. But yeah, you got anything to add to that, Keith?
I agree with you. We have, particularly in December and sometimes January, we have that thin snowpack. We'll get faceting and depth orb that will build very, very rapidly because we have 2 feet of snow or 4 feet of snow instead of 20. I used to ski Mount Baker a good bit in the Pacific Northwest, so that's where I'm originally from. Snurds. All right. Let's see. Folks are hooking up looking for partners. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to point out, guys, don't get caught up in what our snowpack is traditionally like, meaning that, hey, you're in Southern California, it's a maritime climate or a maritime snowpack. Treat each individual instance you go out into the mountains and into the backcountry as an individual instance. There are times when our snowpack looks more like an intermountain snowpack or a continental snowpack because we've had really cold, preseason with a little bit of snow, and that cold weather has actually really made it much more like an intercontinental snowpack than a maritime snowpack. So the true answer is treat each individual time you go out there as that individual moment and look at that snowpack as not as what it typically should be, but what it is at the moment. That's all I have to say.
The most important thing about the snowpack is what the snow looks like under your skis or snowboard at any particular time. John O. Similarly asks any thoughts on reading local snowpack compared to the Sierras. His experience is that it has been super variable. We have very pockety conditions. The grapple that Alan mentioned earlier, created by cyclonic lifting during these storms over the weekend. Because most of our areas in Southern California are below, are at or just below tree line, the grapple can land, as an example, in very discrete and specific spots. So like little landmines. So a big open slope you would think that it would be all the snowpack would look the same, but you dig in 10 different spots and you may get 10 different, very different looking profiles in that snow.
Yeah, for instance, the last time I was up checking the snowpack was Monday, and during that day we started getting some off and on precipitation, and about 1:42 o'clock in the afternoon we got a whole bunch of graupel that came in with some wind, and it got distributed pretty well through the area I was at. It was sticking to the snow, so it was just all over the place. So we can anticipate that that's probably still there because it hasn't really warmed up since then.
So Phil N asks, how many teleskiers does it take to screw in a light bulb? I know the answer to that. It takes 4, 1 to actually turn the light bulb and 3 to say, nice turns, man. Okay. Melissa S. Are there any SoCal area backcountry guide services? Alan, this question's right up your alley.
Yeah, so there's Further Your Adventure. We're a sponsor of the Avalanche Center. I actually run that program and am the backcountry ski snowboard guide, backcountry travel instructor. So if you go to Further Your Adventure, info@furtheryouradventure.com, you can reach out to us. We're also on Instagram @Further Your Adventure. And there's a link on the bottom of the homepage for the Avalanche Center for all of our sponsors. So you can get us through that as well.
Did Alan pay her to ask that question, Keith?
Yeah, a plant. So question from Quinn C. Hey, Quinn, good to hear from you, brother. Says, warming weather is good for snow stabilization. Warming also causes avalanches. After a big storm, is it safer to hit it before the storm ends because the weather hasn't changed, or wait until after the storm ends? So good question. Key thing, Quinn, is not to snowboard with a beer in your hand, lest you may fall down. So the answer is, warming contributes to settlement. Settlement rates above 30%, settlement rates below 15% are bad. Stays really cold, doesn't settle. You can have a longer time of instability following the storm. Settlement rates higher than 30% are indicative of avalanches, but they're usually occurring sometimes naturally. So it's generally safer to ski after the storm, and generally it's safer to ski 24 hours or more after the storm for our maritime snowpack, not taking into account any other factors, warming trends or persistent weak layers, deep instability. If you've got persistent problems within the snowpack, that's all out the window. But when it comes to that maybe 2 feet of snow that you just got out of this storm cycle, 24 hours, if you're getting reasonable settlement rate, something around 20%, probably good to hit it then. That said, those of us who are ski patrollers are skiing through the storm just to make sure that it's safe for all of you.
That's a generalization, and it really depends on a lot of
Exactly.
factors. Going into that, you should be watching the weather, checking the avalanche forecasts, and applying all of that information to your final decision.
And
so,
and
Laura,
by the way, you can make those decisions, Quinn, and change what your plans are. So if we have a big warming event, it's been over 24 hours, there's no persistent weak layers. Maybe I'm staying off the southwest, western slopes, and maybe looking more on the northern slopes, where I'm not getting so much solar radiation. So there's a lot of considerations and things that you could do to change and create your travel plans based upon what's happening with that weather.
Good point. Good point. So Laura W. asks, how does being a recent burn area affect this snowpack and avalanche risk?
Well, really depends. We'll have to see. It could open up some runs. Clearing
well, I mean, oftentimes a big burn, I'm thinking of below Rattlesnake Canyon on the way to Waterman. That big Diablo fire. Some of those slopes south of there were really prone to slide because all of the brush was burned off. I mean, it was burned down to not much but sparse, bigger trees. So that can have an effect. It may eliminate some of the anchors that are available to you, and you may have loose dirt from mudslides from the rain. Also makes it much trickier. Potentially more likely to slide in spring when things get wet. Maybe easier to lubricate the bed surface. Again, you don't have that brush. You have rocks and dirt as your interface with the actual ground.
It's also going to affect access. Since
it may not be an issue because the Forest Service won't let you go.
Some of those areas you probably won't even be able to get into.
So Quinn asks, discuss the fact that the previous couple storms were extremely cold and this one is looking to not be so cold. Yeah, we had 2 cold light dumps. Baldy got about 30 inches, about 20 over just the last 2 days of the weekend through Saturday, Sunday, I guess through Monday morning. Came in cold, came in light, low density.
So we call that upside down. So we've got low, light snow, and we're going to get heavier snow on top, and our snow line is going to go up higher. So that lower elevation snow that's out there is going to get rained on.
Not that much higher though, guys. Snow levels for this one are going to be at around 5,000 feet. So it's not that warm of a storm. It's not the typical AR event. This is a cold AR event, which makes it rather unique and kind of interesting.
Yeah, and just to avoid confusion, when we talk about upside down, we're usually talking about an event that happens during a storm. So an upside down storm is one that comes in cold and flips over and gets warm through that same storm during the same storm event, to be differentiated from an upside down snowpack, which we could potentially see having if this storm, if this cool snow remains low density and we have a big load of heavy snow come in starting Thursday afternoon. Let's see. Any good resources for backcountry skiers to meet up in need of a partner?
You can go to the Facebook page, SoCal Backcountry Skiers.
Yes. And John T says there's a SoCal Backcountry forum on Mountain Project. Let's see. Patrick W. asks, is there a chance of Baldy opening a beacon practice area? We have in the past set up above the bottom of Chair 4 a beacon basin for the public to use. We typically do it in spring when the conditions are nicer and and we don't have a whole lot of travel coming down from Mountain View, that area immediately above where we set up that park. It's a simple beacon basin that allows us to turn on 3 or 4 different bugs buried. Right now, we won't have one. We will be busy. We'll be busy potentially mitigating avalanche hazard this weekend and hopefully more this month. But Patrick, take a look. Watch the Baldy Patrol website and our Facebook page, and we'll notify folks if we put one up this spring.
And if you head to Mammoth, they do have a beacon basin outside of Main Lodge. Just check their website or check with their ski patrol to find out if it's open in operation.
Yeah.
And what kind of restrictions you might have to deal with, especially with COVID-19 right now.
All right. John asks, clarification, please. San Gregorio Wilderness Area is closed, but I understand only parts of the San Bernardino Mountains. Alan, you've got permits in those range. Tell us what's the story.
I'm still not completely sure. The maps are not the easiest to read. It looks like it's not the entire wilderness, but it looks like the access points at the trailheads are closed. So without the access points, it does make it a bit difficult to get in there.
Yeah, we've got a map up on the site, but it is not easy to.
No, it's not easy to decipher. Unfortunately, the National Forest Service doesn't do a great job on their mapping.
By the way, as a follow-up to that exact question is down below with KC, and by the way, that 6,000 foot gate to Waterman is still put you, I think, a mile and a half away from, probably closer to a mile, to Avalanche Canyon, that area. So it's still a pretty good hike.
Yeah, it's about
Yeah.
3 miles to the base of Waterman if you follow the road.
Yeah, that's a
We-
hump. Okay, we'll take this last question. Andrew Y asks, what's the deal with local weather stations? Is it too hard to keep them operational? Well, SoCal Snow has been working on an avalanche, or rather a weather station and telemetry. Alan, why don't you fill folks in? This is, of course, money dependent, but why don't you fill folks in on our plans on San Jay?
Yeah, we've got a partnership working with the San Jacinto State Parks Rangers, and they've given us permission to install a weather station up above 10,000 feet. So we'd actually have something relevant to high elevation conditions, which we have nowhere in these mountains right now. The problem is the cost of getting it up there. We've got probably 2/3 of the funds. It's all the equipment's going to cost us around $7 to $8 grand. So we need more donations to raise those funds. And on that note, I will say that we have a fundraising event planned. It's going to be a virtual online event, and we have a Jones split board donated. We've got Spark R&D bindings. We've got stuff from Mountain Hardware. ARC'TERYX is going to put up some really nice stuff, and we've got more items coming in. So as we get these items together, we'll put the whole thing together and let you guys know through all of our outlets when it goes live, and you'll have the opportunity to get some cool stuff.
Excellent. Well, speaking of swag, Alan?